Thank you all for joining us for the Planning and Managing a Class workshop. Joining us today is Ted Weisman, Embedded Instructional Technologist at the Office of Online Education. He's going to discuss how to develop, implement, and refine a course plan and how to manage a class effectively. I'm going to hand it over to him to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I don't know how to say your name. I apologize. I should have asked.
Ege.
Ege, as Ege said, my name is Ted Weisman. I'm an embedded instructional technologist with the Office of Online Education. I'm also a part-time instructor with the College of Education. And I was a graduate assistant, and I taught while I was a graduate assistant before I got my PhD. So I've been in your shoes. In terms of what it's like to manage, being in the space of being a teaching graduate assistant. And also I have, my background is in K-12 education. So I worked in K-12 education for 11 years, and my PhD is in teacher education. So really, I care about preparing teachers to help them be successful in the classroom environment, whether it's online or in person. I really want everyone to have a successful and good experience, both the faculty and the students. With that being said, this is essentially what Ege was talking about in terms of this is what we're going to be talking about today. Whether you're a teaching assistant or instructor record, the goal is to know how to plan and manage a class. Here are some of our objectives: how to structure the class meetings, manage your time, how to anticipate and respond to common classroom management concerns and objectives, learn about course learning objectives and how to align them to program objectives, learn how to use classroom management tools on popular video conferencing, and then schedule, make appointments via web campus. So we'll go through all that stuff, but really these are our objectives and what we might, and things that we'll touch on, but we'll touch on a variety of other stuff as well. So to begin with, what we will cover, we'll start with the framework, and then we'll get into that planning, managing. I added in assessing because it's key to planning and managing your class. You need to know how you're going to assess your students, and then we're going to have a closing. So we'll start with the framework. The first is there's two parts to your success, is being aware of your time and being aware of your presence. So when we talk about time matters because it matters how you're teaching, right? Whether you're in person, whether you're synchronous, whether you're asynchronous, whether you're web-based, whether you're hybrid. Each of these environments is different, and therefore how you allot your time matters. So an in-person class versus a totally asynchronous class, you have very different time restrictions and time requirements, both imposed on yourself and on your students. So once you have established what you're teaching, you can start then really looking into, once we get into the planning and managing, you can look at what your time is. But it's key to realize that the modality that you're teaching does impact the time requirement for you. And so, you're able to do different things, whether you're teaching in person or online, or whether you're doing an asynchronous web-based. So this is all interconnected. So you really want to be aware of the modality as you get started. And then when we talk about presence, what we do is we have what's called the community of inquiry. Now, this applies more to the online presence because there's a lot of things that you can do in person and navigate that you can't do. You have to be more deliberate and intentional in the online space. So when we talk about the presence, there's three different presences. There's a social presence, the cognitive presence, and the teaching presence. When you're doing an in-person class, you have a natural social component. Kids are able, or students are able to sit next to each other. They're able to engage with one another. There are natural breaks in the class and things like that. So there's a social dynamic that's created in person. If you're teaching online, you need to recreate that. Same thing with the cognitive presence, right? You're able to assess students as they're going through content. You're able to be aware of it. But if you're an online, you need to be a little bit more cognizant and more intentional with what you do. And then finally, the teaching presence. This is when you walk into a classroom, people understand that you're the instructor. You have a certain amount of command to the room. There's a certain dynamic that's created, and just in the way the class is structured and the interactions that you have. And once again, you have to be deliberate and intentional in creating that space when you are in the online, if you have an online component to your class. So what does that mean? So social presence is the degree to which learners feel socially and emotionally connected with others in an online environment. And we'll talk more about this when we get into the planning and the managing a class, but it's really key to understand that if you're going to be in an online space, depending on which modality that you're teaching in, that you're doing things that are creating that social presence, you're creating that level of community. I can say that I've taken online classes that I felt very disconnected, right? I felt like all I was doing was going through the motions, doing my assignments, getting my work done. I didn't feel like I was a part of anything. It was a very perfunctory, just task oriented, just doing it to do it, to get it done and get through it so I get my grade. That's not the goal of an online class. We want to recreate as much as possible a sense of community. And we want the students to know that they're valued and that they're available, that the instructor is available. We want them to succeed. When we talk about the teaching presence, this is the context that consider that their instructor is essentially involved in their learning. We know that if students feel like the instructor cares, they're going to work harder. They're going to do more. So, creating a learning experience for students with instructor facilitation, support, and guidance. This has a lot to do with the types of assignments, tasks, and assessments that you plan on using in your class. And they create that level of presence for you where you're able to provide that feedback, that interaction, that way. And what you do, whether you show up in discussions, whether you do video announcements, whether you do video feedback, whether you use annotation within SpeedGrader, there's a variety of things that you can do that will help you show up differently in the class. And it's critical for the student learning experience because if you are not present in the class, then the students are essentially just doing all the learning on their own. And that's not what we want to accomplish. Finally, we have the cognitive presence. The cognitive presence is to help students develop the means to move beyond the early stages of learning. So this is ultimately, are students really learning what they need to learn, or are they just going through the motions? Are they just accomplishing things for the sake of getting it done? Did they do the assignment for week 1 but they forgot it for week 2 because it's not relevant? Have we made that connecting thread as instructors where we're connecting all of our content throughout the course? So you want to connect ideas, apply new ideas. You want to set the curriculum, set the climate for learning, and inject knowledge from diverse sources. So really, how do you, and we're going to talk about in the planning section, how do you really do this? Because a lot of this starts with the planning. So I'm going to kind of pause right here. Does anybody have any questions in terms of the 3 presences, or does it kind of make sense? So I'll move on now to what we're really here for, right? So planning versus managing. So planning is what you do prior to the start of class. Yes, that might seem like, oh, duh, obviously, but really there's a lot of work that's gone into planning a class, and you'll see as I bulleted out what the different things are that you do. Managing is the work you do during the class period or over the course of the class time. So really you want to make sure that they require different skills. There are some people who are awesome at like setting curriculum, creating assessments, doing objectives, and they really don't, and they struggle in the class environment, right? They're not so awesome at providing feedback. Maybe they, struggle a little bit with building the relationships with students or doing things like that. So you really want to, recognize that there are different skill sets to planning and then there are to managing. So when we talk about planning, there are a bunch of things that go into it. So what I've done is I've kind of broken it up into these sections. So the first thing is your syllabus. Now, as a graduate assistant, you might not really have a lot of say in the syllabus that's created. But what I want to do is I want to draw your attention to some things about it because the syllabus is key. And so let me go back here. And so I have an example of a syllabus right here. from a class this is a class that I taught. And the reason why I'm showing this example is that what I liked about it is that it has course goals, which are really important, what you're trying to accomplish in terms of your course. Then it has course learning objectives, which these are just specific to this course in and of itself. All right. And then we have the ULOs, which are the undergraduate, university undergraduate learning assessments, right? I mean, learning out objectives. And then what's really important is that you really want to be explicit with anything that is any policies that matter. So, there's a lot of times that we are not always explicit with our students with our expectations. We assume that they know things, but really with the syllabus sets the tone for what you're able to refer back to. And so this is what we do the first day of class. You usually have even a syllabus quiz or something like that, there's an acknowledgement that you want to do so that, students do that. So for our class, one of the big things was attendance, right? This was an in-person class. So as you can see here, students fail after five missed classes. This is a huge point of contention, but it's really something that if it's not communicated early on, students might not really recognize how important their attendance is. In addition, this is where you get to always refer back and you get to kind of talk about how the course is created, how the course is designed. You really want to be you want your assignments to be explicit, and you want to be able to say, here's what's expected. You go through this. This really sets, as Ege said, like the course outline. And if you haven't done a solid job of creating a very comprehensive syllabus, you're ultimately setting yourself up for challenges later on. So really, you want to make sure that you've gone through the syllabus is clear, and it's clear with students. And you can see that this is a very extensive syllabus. The other part that I liked about this syllabus is that this right here shows each assessment or assignment, and it aligns it to an objective. So this really is key because the students are able to see where they're being what assignment relates to what objective. There's nothing that's done in isolation. You're not creating any assignment just for the sake of creating an assignment. So we'll talk about this when we get to assessment, but this leads directly to the second thing in what matters is your objectives. Now, right here, as you can see, we've created our assignments so that each assignment is related not only to the ULOs, but the CLOs, so that there's no assignment that is done in a vacuum. Students are able to see that there was thought, intentionality, and purpose put into everything that's created. Now, if you have a question, there's always on the UNLV website, you can always just search, search ULOs. And then if you didn't know, there's also GLOs, so GLOs. So there's graduate learning objectives as well. And so with this, you want to make sure that when you're planning your course, that you are looking at what are the objectives that you are really focusing on with the assignments, with the content that you're delivering, with all that stuff. And if you can't connect something to an objective, then you have to think, why is it going to be in my class? So you really want to have that intentionality with everything that you're creating. The next thing is Canvas. Whether you're teaching so I'll pause right there. I know I'm going pretty fast. It's just that there's kind of a lot of content. Any questions about kind of the syllabus, the objectives? Does this make sense? Are we good with that? Awesome. All right. Thank you. That's my little formative assessment there, asking for a thumbs up. I appreciate it. So the next thing that we have, whether you're teaching in an online space, so whether you're doing asynchronous or whether you're doing synchronous or whether you're using a Canvas shell, okay? So one of the two things that you need to get comfortable with, and in my opinion, when it comes to Canvas, is the use of announcements and the use of modules. So I have a link here. This is another class where this professor does weekly announcements. And these announcements guide students, right? And so if you even just look at what the titles are, it talks about the task, the literature review. Right here this week, we take the work you've done thus far and begin to expand and shape. I'm not going to go into each announcement, but ultimately, this is your opportunity, especially if you're in the asynchronous environment or you're in an environment that you're not seeing students on a regular basis or in person. This is where you can guide students and make sure that they are accessing content the way that you want them to. So you can see that this instructor has done an amazing job of just each week, upcoming products, assignment deadlines, module 2, giving different, and just kind of giving students those nudges and those steps that help move them through. Announcements is a great function. The next thing is modules. There is, we've all been in classes where their courses are organized really well and courses are not organized really well, right? Where it's just one module with all the content, right? One module with just a group of files, one module with all the presentations, one module that whatever. My as not only an embedded instructional technologist, but also as an instructor and someone that helps people with their classes, is have weekly modules, have an overview, you have your content, you have your tasks, and your overview can be really simple. It can be just a page with the objectives or whatever it is. This instructor has a PowerPoint that they do every week, and this is their introduction. And right here, I'll show you what they do is they have this. So this just kind of gives an overview of what it is. It kind of gives the content that they want them to get. And this is in addition to any readings or any videos or anything else. This is your kind of 30,000-foot view of what the student should be doing this week. This is really important and really helpful. If you don't have an overview each week, I highly suggest that you use one. It's not only good for you because it organizes your content, it's good for your students. So that's kind of like the two key things about Canvas. Use your announcements, set up your modules. Make sure that those are like kind of like my two, if you get two things out of Canvas, do those things in the planning phase, because you have to plan this. You have to create this. You have to set this up prior to the start of class. The next thing that we have is that whether or not you're using a platform, right? So to conduct your class. Now, just so we're clear, UNLV supports WebEx and Panopto. So WebEx is the platform that UNLV supports. It's integrated into Canvas. I'll show you right here. If you look over here on the left-hand side, you're enabled to have not only your Panopto recordings, this is integrated into Canvas, and so is WebEx. Both of these are integrated, and therefore, if you have any issues, you are able to reach out to OIT and they can support you. So you can, when you're in WebEx and you are planning your meetings and you're going through and you're trying to figure out, how to schedule an event or how to check your event attendance or do things like that, OIT will support you. If you're using Zoom or Google Meet, OIT does not support those two. So you're kind of on your own. So just to be aware of that, and I just kind of want to make it clear, there's a lot of faculty, there are whole colleges that use Zoom and Google Meet, but if you're going to use and you want to get the full integration and kind of the full backing, I can't access my video or students are having trouble accessing my video. If you recorded a lecture or you recorded a presentation and you didn't do it in one of these services, you didn't do it in WebEx or Panopto, then UNLV can't help you. But if you do use those two services, they can help you. So that is one thing just to kind of keep in mind as you're doing that. Whether or not you use WebEx or Panopto, this is a handy little tool. And I'll put it in the chat for you to kind of access on your own. Um, and it just kind of lets you know which one should you be using, right? Whether or not you should use WebEx, whether or not you should use Panopto. What type of recording do you want to use? Panopto, you're enabled to is it so this is in the planning section because you want to figure out ahead of time what you're going to do. How are you going to present your content? So this is really important. The next thing is your materials. So whether or not you have your materials, whether it's digital or in person. So are you having your files? Are you having handouts? You want to make sure that, like, I know this kind of seems, yeah, duh, but it really is a lot there. If you haven't planned ahead of time and you're not clear about what you want to do, then you don't have what you need. So it's essential to have your materials prepared ahead of time. And especially if you're doing an online class, you want to make sure that they're available to students. So you've opened up, you've published your material. You've made sure that it's accessible, and we'll talk about accessibility briefly in a minute. But you want to make sure that you've prepared your materials, whether they're in person or online. I not only teach my class, so I teach an in-person class, everything's available online. I also give students hard copies, right? So I give students hard copies of the rubric for their paper that's due on Sunday, and I go through that rubric in person, even though it's available virtually, right? There's nothing wrong with even recording a video where you walk through the rubric and you explain it, right? And put it in there for the students. So just make sure that you have thought about making your materials available. The next thing is activities. So there's a difference between assignments and tasks. And what I mean by that is that in the in-person space, we have students doing a lot of stuff, right? We engage in discussion. We have them, working together with a partner. We have them having, whether they're doing a sheet, a graphic organizer, working through a math problem, a science problem, you're teaching chemistry, whatever it is, we do that. But ultimately, what you want to do is you want to be clear about what is an assignment, meaning something that you want to grade, and what is a task, something that you want them to just do in terms of learning. And so you really want to be clear about what it is that you're creating. And you want to connect all these things back to your objectives. So you want to connect whether it's an assignment or a task, back to an objective. Because and not everything needs to be graded. We don't grade everything that we do, but we want to be clear about that. Do we want to engage in a discussion? Do we not want to engage in a discussion? Is this something where I need to have students maybe do a reflection on what they just did? Is it, and so you want to plan ahead of time what you're doing. The last thing, and I'll put this link in the video in the chat as well. Accessibility right now is and has always been a huge thing. If you're not aware now, we have the Ally reporting tool where each class, if I look at like the Ally accessibility report, it lets me know whether or not the course is accessible. And so what I put in the chat is, and this will let you know what's accessible and what's not accessible. You can go through and start fixing it. But what I put in the chat is an excellent kind of guideline. They're guiding videos that I give to faculty to help them create accessible documents, accessible PowerPoints, accessible PDFs, that type of thing. We also have the Office of Accessibility Resources, which does a variety of trainings and make sure that ensures accessibility. But anything that you put in your course, you want to make sure that it's accessible. So I just want to be really explicit about that accessibility is a huge thing. Make sure whatever you create is accessible. So I'm going to pause right there and ask, do we have any questions about planning? Awesome. All right. So once we've done all this, now this can take hours, it could take minutes, it can take as long as it takes. As a graduate assistant, a lot of the planning is potentially done for you by the head instructor or the lead instructor or whoever it is, but you have to take the time to go through the syllabus, to go through the objectives, to go through the Canvas shell, to make sure you're comfortable with WebEx or Panopto, to be familiar with the materials, to understand what it is that the students are doing in class, and make sure that things are accessible. So this takes time as well. Whether you created the class or not, it's important that you've gone through kind of each of these steps. Then when we go back to, so managing, here's the thing. We already talked about aligning content to the objectives. And I just talked about that. I showed that great table from a previous syllabus. Here are the specific, so if you have the ULOs and you look here, here are the specific learning objectives that align. And what's key about these is that are the action verbs, the Bloom's taxonomy, these things right here: demonstrate, identify, apply, transfer, achieve. These are the things that you want students to be able to do. So this is related to, in the class, what you're doing, are these being achieved? So you've made sure that your content, your activities, and your tasks all align with that. The next thing is that your presentation. PowerPoints are great and they're fun, and we all are familiar with them, but there are a variety of other resources out there that you might want to use. And so I suggest that you take a look at things like Nearpod, Pear Deck, or Miro. All three of those are presentation software or interactive softwares that you could use. I didn't want to spend too much time kind of going through this because I'm not here to kind of sell either one. But it's worth looking at if you're really trying to beef up your interactivity, or you want to do different things, because Nearpod allows you to embed questions within your presentation. Pear Deck, you can record audio directly. Miro is kind of a software that has kind of templates that you can use and things like that. So there are alternatives that you might want to explore should you want to do something different than what is presented. The other reason is, I also don't know about how much autonomy you have as the graduate assistant to veer off track, right? Like how much you're able to imbue the course with your own teaching and learning style, right? So some people have to follow a more regimented and structured class structure, or organization. Others are given a little bit more free reign in their teaching. So depending on what you have or what's available to you, I just suggest take a look at these. You can sign up for them for free, and use them as you see fit. The next thing is interaction. When you are talking about, managing your class, you really want to set up what you're doing for interaction. Now, in person, we do this naturally, right? We know that the classes that we get the most out of are the ones where we're interactive, where it's not just stand and deliver. We're more facilitators than we are presenters. And so you really want to have clear guidelines. Canva, yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great resource as well. Thank you for putting that in there. And so you want to be deliberate in where you have your discussions, and you want to make sure that you are ultimately allowing student discourse to occur. This happens a little bit more naturally in the in-person space. In the online space, you really have to be deliberate in the type of questions that you ask. So, and you really want to move away from the ask two questions and respond to one other person in the comments. You really want to try to be dynamic with the discussions that you have. Maybe use the groups function. Maybe have students do recordings of a video, like record a reflection and respond to do a video recording. You want to kind of beef up what you do. If you are using a WebEx, there are breakout rooms. So you can break up, if you didn't know, you can break up your discussion. You can break up your class into breakout rooms and use those for discussions. And you can then pop from breakout room to breakout room to breakout room to kind of see how the discussion is going. There's different interactives such as Slido and Jamboard. Slido allows you to, it's a integration that exists within WebEx that allows you to do polling and ask questions. You can create word clouds. You can do a lot of things. Um, it's a great interactive tool. Jamboard, it's a Google property. I can show you right here. These are kind of some Jamboards that I've used in my previous classes where, I'll just kind of click on uh, this one right here. We had pre-development ideas. So, these are just where we were able to kind of post, what are the ideas? What did you need for pre-development? This is for a course. And then put an X in the one on the sticky note that you used. So this is an online thing. And so this is something you can do if you're doing like a synchronous class, or you're even doing a hybrid class and everybody has a device. They're able to go on and log in. You might use RebelFlex or something like that. But the key is that you're doing something that is creating interactivity. And so whichever one you want to use, you just kind of, once again, this is, you've thought it out, but you're doing stuff that is help promoting that interaction with students. Now, in order to determine that interaction, you really have to think about engagement. And when I say engagement, what are you doing? What are you doing in terms of whole group versus small group versus individual? What is a task? What is an activity? What is an assignment that you can do as the whole group? What can then be broken up into small groups or even peer to peer? And what can be done on the individual basis? In theory, you should have all three going on in a class period at some point in time. You want to make sure that you're giving that variety and you're allowing students to not only move. So this is, like I said, in an in-person class where we like, hey, talk to the person next to you. Hey, get in a group of four. Hey, do this. In Canvas, you want to create these environments. And so what you can do is you have the ability, and I'll show you in this class right here. In this class right here, in the people task, if you go into people, groups, small groups, and in each group, you can then do a small group discussion. You can do something where it's only 4 or 5 students. You can break them up into smaller groups, and then they have doing peer review, peer things like that. You can do stuff like that. So this is a really good example of how you can create groups in Canvas and then allow for that small group environment in the canvas space. And then I'm going to put this in the chat as well. If you are ever struggling for types of activities, right? So any type of activity that you want to use, these are activities that you can use. And it even on, so this is a great tool that I provide to instructors, where it allows you to think about what it is that you want to do, right? So whether it's easy, medium. So if you look on the left side, easy, medium, complex, the amount of prep time. And then right down here is what I really like is the active learning, individual, small group, large group, discussion based. It allows you can then click on what it is. It tells you what to do, and it kind of gives you activities that you can then click from and use, and you can go through. And you can see it also talks about your modality, of what modality that you want to use and stuff like that. So that's just another great example of what activities you want to do. And by doing these activities and allowing the variation, this gives you that interaction that kind of beefs up that presence that you have in the class. Going back to our presences, this promotes that social presence, the cognitive presence within each of your classes. So I'll pause here and I'll wait and ask if anybody has any questions regarding uh, the managing a class.
How important is attendance? That
This is the thing that really that ultimately it depends on your class that you're teaching, right? So if you're teaching an asynchronous class and you're, you know, they're just accessing the content, um, then then it you really it's more about engagement with the online content, and you're monitoring that engagement with the online content. In person, I think attendance is tremendously important. I think that, you know, the student is, it's why in the classes that I have that ultimately, if you don't attend, you don't get to pass. Because if you're in a space where they're not getting, I think what the students should be getting in the in person space should be different than what's available online. So, therefore, if they're not getting what's in person, they're missing key, vital, essential information. So therefore, if if you are not delivering content and you're not delivering key, essential, vital things in your in-person class, then what's the point of your in-person class? Right? If ultimately the student can just get everything online, then what are you doing with your in-person time? So you really have to ask yourself what it is that you're doing with your in-person time, that so that you can make it so that you can say that it's valuable. So I think that that really kind of it speaks to what you're doing with that class.
thank you. And I have another question.
Sure.
Someone is asking, do you think there are certain activities that are less successful in in-person classes with 100 plus students?
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, what you really want to do, I just had this conversation uh um I just had this conversation with an instructor, and we were talking about the difference between. And you know what? We can. This is actually a great question, because this goes right into assessment and how we're assessing students. So great question, because so I'll go into this. Right here, I have the idea of high stakes versus low stakes assessments. So I was just speaking to a chemistry instructor, and we were talking about he teaches chemistry 100 or a chemistry 103 or one of the, and there's 200 people in the class. And ultimately, if the students aren't passing the assignments or the like they're not able to um, pass the high stakes assessments and don't have the content, they're not going to be successful down the road. So you can't really do a lot of low stakes, give like students the ability to get participation points. You can't really do that. You can't, the discussions don't matter. They really have to demonstrate mastery to move on. So I would argue that it's not necessarily the size of the class, it's the content of the class. So what you can do is that if you're teaching 100 students, you know what? You can do some quick little, like, hey, turn and talk to your partner, you know, hey, let's do a quick little reflection, hey, let's do that type of thing where we can do that. You can embed in, you know, I personally would embed, you know, time in my class to, you know, where people, and I would maybe even employ embed time for questions, maybe even employ a flipped class model where I'm requiring students to do work prior to coming to class. So therefore they can get more out of the in-person class. And it's not about, and I can really assess where students are. That's what this chemistry teacher does, is the chemistry professor does a flipped class model where he gives the students the content, they work through the problems, and ultimately they come to class and then they get feedback on those problems, right? He takes the time and goes through that. Uh, but without a doubt, there is the size of the class. You're not going to break up, and also I mean, if you're in a huge lecture hall, how are you going to break it up into groups of 5, right? How are you going to break up your class into that? So really, what I think you want to do is you want to look at what is it that, going back to your objectives and going back to the content that you prepared, what is it that you want students to get out of that class period? And if ultimately there are activities that serve that objective, use those. Like I would, like, I'm a big fan of thumbs up. I'm a big fan of just kind of doing a lot of checks for understanding this formative right here, this formative assessment, this real time type thing. Tickets out the door, those types of things where there's things that I'm ensuring that students are getting content, or they're at least, staying on track, or some sort of guided notes or something like that, where they have to submit something at the end of class, or they, maybe go into the discussion and do a post afterwards. Something like that, I think are really good. But I think you're putting yourself, you really want to think about, like I said, I would go back to the objectives and think about where does my objective align with what activity that I'm doing, and how am I being most productive to ensure that the students are getting the most out of the content. So a lot of that goes back to that planning, like what are the students doing prior to coming to class. That was a very long-winded answer. I apologize. I really kind of like went in a bunch of different directions. I hope that somewhat answered your question.
Yes, that was very informative. Thank you.
Okay. Um, but it is a great lead in ultimately to the idea of how you're assessing your students. Because what you want to do is you really want to think about whether or not you're using formative assessment, whether or not you're doing summative assessment. So a formative assessment is real time. It's that check for understanding. It's to ensure that students are, moving in the right place, and then it guides your instruction. In person, this is really easy to do, right? I can get thumbs up. I can tell that people are kind of, their eyes are glazed over. They're not really paying attention. I can ask the question, hey, how is everybody doing right now? Do I need to review that? In online space, you need to create this, right? You need to create checks for understanding. You need to create tasks that are like, hey, maybe a mid-semester review or a mid-semester survey. Like, so far, where are we at? Getting a pulse check, doing a pulse check for students. Like, hey, how did we do on the previous assignment? I noticed that on the previous assignment, a lot of people didn't do well. Do I need to record a video explaining the presentation, right? This is a great use of an announcement, but like really being cognizant of how students are progressing through class. Summative, it really guides content, right? So you're looking at the grades, and then you're ultimately, providing remediation or extension as needed. And so that means that you're like, awesome, it looks like we're already moving along. It seems like everybody got this. We can move on to the next thing. Or it's, oh no, we need to go back. I need to review it. People's papers, the papers that everybody turned in. Maybe you scaffold assignments, you break it up into smaller parts, you do different things, and then you reflect on your practice. So what you're going to do is, this is more like saying, hey, this class was not successful. I'm going to change it next semester. Now, this is why we advocate for like mid-semester surveys for students, where we do like kind of a pulse check, and we send it out to students where they say, so far, how are you doing? Do you feel the content? Do you feel the class is paced well? Do you feel like how do you feel like you're doing? Things like that. It is a great, tool and a great resource. Um, like I said, talking about that high stakes versus low stakes, you really shouldn't be having only exams and finals. There should be things along the way that let you know how students are doing and give student easy access points. So for example, I have an instructor that's teaching a action research. It's a graduate level course. And in the action research, they do an assignment where they come up with their research question. Then they do an assignment where it's their annotated bibliography. Then they do an assignment where it's their methodology. And then they do an assignment where it's their application or findings. And then they do an assignment where it's their conclusion. And then in theory, you take all 5 of those things and it's their final assignment, right? And that is their final paper. So what you've done is you've set students up for success. If they haven't done well on their research question, you're not waiting till the last minute to find out. You can give them feedback in the beginning and help them be successful in that right up front so that then they can do that. You can give them feedback on the annotated bibliography, feedback on their methodology, feedback on their conclusions, feedback on their implications. There's a good question. Is this a survey we build ourselves? Absolutely. We have templates that you can that we can do, and I could even provide it. You can just reach out to me, and I can provide a survey. But also, it's something you can build yourself if you have specific questions that you want to ask. So, but we have templates. So no, it's not something that you have to build yourself. Now, I will say that this is, you want to make sure that you've talked to whoever your lead instructor is and they are doing this and that type of thing, but it's not a survey that you have to build yourself. No, we can absolutely help you. We have templates. Um, so getting to the final piece is feedback. Is make sure that you're providing feedback timely and relevant. There's nothing worse than students doing assignments and not getting feedback. You need to make sure that you are, and this goes to managing a class, because you can't manage your class if you're not providing feedback. You can't plan the next thing that you're going to do or implement the next assignment if you haven't graded and given feedback, because you don't know where your students are at. And the students don't know what to do next. So this is why I've added assessing in here, is that if you're not doing the assessing component, you can't really manage a class. All you're doing is you're kind of on autopilot. And that is not good for anybody. So we all been in classes where we don't get feedback, and it's not fun, because then you're just kind of sitting in limbo, and ultimately it just is it's not a good place to be. So with that, I have here, so the difference between formative and summative assessment, you have, so summative is the assessment of learning, formative is assessment as learning, or assessment for learning. So as you can see, the high stakes assessment is assessment of learning. Those are your exams, those are your final papers, those are your kind of content driven things. Your assessment for learning or your assessment as learning are more the things that you're doing to ensure that students are moving on the continuum, right? And you're going through and you're helping guide them, and you're providing them feedback so that they can be successful on their high stakes stuff. So this is where you've broken down assignments, you're asking questions, you're giving things chunked, and you're scaffolding and that type of thing. So it really is, this is, you do a lot of, maybe your formative is also where they can do like peer-to-peer stuff. They're doing in small groups. And one thing I will advocate for is the creation of rubrics for any summative assessment. So, where you have a rubric that shows you exactly what students need to do in order to be successful. So rubrics are some of your best friends. So I would advocate for you to use rubrics in anything that you do, especially with summative assessments. So I'll pause here and ask any questions about assessment. All right. So with that, so in-person versus online classroom management discussion. So as I've stated, it all depends on where you're at. But really, what you want to do is good practice is just good practice. And so what it comes down to is this. In the in-person, you go in and you can explicitly state, these are my expectations. My expectation is for you to put your phone down, to take your earpods out, to take out notes, to do this, to do that, to do whatever. And online, you need to do the same thing. This is where your syllabus comes into play. This is where announcements comes into play. This is where you are setting your guidelines. You have clear deadlines. You have clear expectations, and you're being explicit up front. So that's something that you want to do. In person in your room organization, how do you organize the classroom to promote the most things? Now, when you have a large class of 100, you don't really have a whole lot of things, but ultimately if you have a smaller class, are you putting people side by side? Are they facing each other? Are they facing you? Course organization, this is where your modules come into play. This is how you've organized your files. This is how you've organized your the content within your course. So you want to make sure that you do that. Next, you have ground rules for interactions. Do you have people raise hand? Is it open forum? In person, you can do this. In the online space, you want to set the same thing. These are my expectations for discussions. These are my expectations for how you reply. I expect you to reply in full sentences. I expect you to, answer the prompt. I expect you to reply to two of your peers. You want to be, I expect, you to use appropriate language. I expect you to write in APA format. What are the different things that you're doing? And then finally, materials and resources. This goes back to your preparation and planning. You want to make sure that if you have anything, you're prepared in person. Same thing goes for online. You want to make sure that you have given the appropriate access to students and their materials, and everything is available to them in terms of what they do. So this is how you kind of manage your classroom management. These are the overall things that you want to do. So with that, I'll kind of leave it at this, is that the best teacher are those who show where to look but don't tell you what to see. You really want to set the space, and you want to be a guide for students. This goes back to the question about what do we like, is attendance important? Ultimately, if you're not doing things that are meaningful in your classroom, that are guiding students, that they're not getting stuff that is relevant, then they're not going to want to be in the class. And so you really need to be the one that is facilitating and really injecting. You want to be, be proactive, be positive, be yourself. And that is kind of what I want to see. Like ultimately, if you're going to be successful as an instructor, you've kind of gone through this whole process, and you're really are able to help students be successful in the class. So, their success is your success. And I'll kind of leave it at that. And I think I went pretty much the whole time. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Ted, and we'll just open it up for some questions and wait a little bit, and then we'll go from there. Anybody that would like to ask questions, they can unmute themselves and ask too, or type it in the chat.
You're welcome. I'm happy. Hopefully I know some of it seems kind of like basic, but it's just doing the work. It really is. It's just doing it and getting in there. And, I think you kind of add your own little flavor to things. So I think going through the process is really helpful.
It was definitely helpful and informative. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
To conclude, okay, there is a question.
Sure.
This may sound kind of silly, but how do you know how much time to give students when you ask them to turn to people next to them to discuss?
So that's a great question. I would say it's like 1 to 2 minutes, all things considered. Like be like, okay, I'm going to give you 1 to 2 minutes, go. If you really talk for a minute straight, that's a lot of talking. If you like all things considered, if you give someone a couple minutes, it all depends on what you're trying to get out of it, what you want them to kind of deliver to each other. But I would say that it's just a couple minutes. Like I'm going to give you a couple minutes. One person go, okay, switch. I would even time it and be like, okay, time's up. Next person talk. That type of thing. If you want to do it that way, but it doesn't need to be. It's not. You're not. The goal isn't to take up a lot of time. If you think about it, a couple minutes is a lot of time to talk. If
Thank
they're
you.
actually talking to each other.
Thank you. Then to conclude, before we end today's session, we would like to thank to our presenter Ted for sharing his time and expertise with us today, and we would like to thank to our participants for joining us today. Before you all log off, please take a few minutes to fill out the workshop feedback survey we just dropped in the chat. It helps us a lot moving forward, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you once again, Ted, for being here.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Yes. Have a happy Friday.